The fire marshal's office said the recent warehouse fires were coincidental. No evidence of arson, no identifiable patterns. What they didn't know was that the answer was working the dispatch radio at the volunteer fire department, recognizing arson coordination through the eyes of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades investigating criminals who used deliberately set fires to commit insurance fraud that destroyed businesses and endangered lives. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of protecting communities from arsonists who endanger firefighters and destroy property for profit, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Riverside Volunteer Fire Department served 3 rural townships from a converted garage that had grown over 40 years into a modern emergency response facility staffed by dedicated volunteers who dropped everything when emergency calls came in. The department responded to structure fires, vehicle accidents, medical emergencies, and hazardous material incidents with the kind of professional commitment that made communities trust their safety to neighbors who trained every week to save lives and protect property. Bill Thompson had been volunteering as emergency dispatcher for 4 years, managing 911 calls, coordinating response teams, and maintaining communication with firefighters during dangerous operations. At 61, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired communications specialist who wanted to give back to his community by ensuring that emergency services operated efficiently and effectively when people needed help most. But Bill's analysis of emergency patterns went far beyond normal dispatch operations. While most fire department dispatchers focused on coordinating rapid response, managing equipment logistics, and maintaining communication protocols, Bill automatically analyzed fire locations, timing patterns, and incident characteristics with the trained eye of someone who understood how deliberate arson was used to commit insurance fraud while endangering the firefighters who responded to save property that criminals had intentionally destroyed. What the volunteer firefighters didn't know was that Bill Thompson had never been a communications specialist. For 18 years, he'd been Senior Investigator Bill Thompson, State Arson Investigation Division, specializing in insurance fraud fires, conspiracy cases, and criminal networks that used deliberately set blazes to collect insurance payments while destroying businesses, homes, and sometimes entire neighborhoods to cover evidence of financial crimes or generate fraudulent payouts. His retirement 4 years ago had been earned through nearly 2 decades of investigating arson crimes that killed innocent people and endangered firefighters. His ability to recognize arson patterns had been permanent. Station 12, respond to structure fire at 1847 Industrial Boulevard, Bill announced over the radio as volunteer firefighters rushed to their trucks. But his trained eye was already noting that this was the 4th warehouse fire in 6 weeks, all occurring during overnight hours when buildings were unoccupied, all involving properties with recent insurance policy increases. What bothered Bill wasn't the frequency of fires. Rural areas sometimes experienced clusters of blazes due to weather conditions, equipment failures, or seasonal factors. What concerned him was the pattern of fires that matched arson techniques he'd seen in insurance fraud investigations, where criminals burned buildings to collect payouts while eliminating evidence of business failures or financial crimes. Over the next month, Bill found himself conducting the kind of analysis that had characterized his arson investigation career. Not obvious law enforcement work, just the systematic examination of fire patterns that distinguished accidental blazes from deliberate arson designed to commit insurance fraud. The evidence was becoming clear. The warehouse fires occurred at specific intervals that allowed insurance claims to be processed before the next incident. The properties involved had recently changed ownership or increased their insurance coverage. And most concerning, Bill recognized specific burn patterns and ignition techniques that suggested professional arson rather than accidental fires. "Bill," said Captain Mike Rodriguez, the fire department's senior officer, "we've been having a lot of structure fires lately, more than usual for this time of year." Bill had coordinated emergency responses to all of them, documenting details that fire departments recorded for incident reports, but that also provided evidence of criminal arson when analyzed by someone with investigation experience. "What's your sense of the causes?" Bill asked, though he already knew the fire patterns indicated deliberate arson rather than accidental blazes. "Hard to say. The fire marshal's office says they're all within normal parameters for accidental fires, but something feels coordinated." Bill's training immediately activated. When experienced firefighters described fires as feeling coordinated, they were often observing arson patterns that suggested criminal intent rather than accidental ignition. That evening, Bill did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He called a number that connected him to people who still investigated the crimes he'd once specialized in preventing. State Arson Investigation Division, Investigator Maria Santos speaking. "Maria, this is Bill Thompson." There was a pause. "Bill? How's the volunteer fire service treating you?" "Combustibly," Bill said, sitting at his kitchen table with dispatch logs and fire incident reports that looked like normal emergency documentation but represented potential evidence of systematic arson conspiracy. "Maria, I need to report suspected arson involving coordinated insurance fraud fires." Investigator Santos had worked with Bill for 10 years before his retirement. She knew that when Bill Thompson called about suspected arson, it meant criminals were setting fires to commit insurance fraud while endangering the firefighters who risked their lives responding to deliberately set blazes. "What are you seeing?" Bill provided details with the precision that had made him legendary in arson investigations: fire patterns, timing analysis, insurance indicators, and ignition techniques that suggested organized arson conspiracy rather than accidental fires. "Bill," Santos said after he finished, "will coordinate with insurance fraud and organized crime units. Can you maintain normal dispatch operations while we develop the investigation?" "Affirmative," Bill said. "But they're accelerating the fires. Based on the pattern timing and insurance claim processing, they're planning additional arsons before investigators can identify the coordination." What happened next was 18 years of arson investigation expertise compressed into the most important emergency dispatch shift of Bill's civilian life. He returned to Riverside Fire Department the following evening, not just as a volunteer dispatcher coordinating emergency responses, but as an experienced investigator conducting surveillance in an environment where arsonists thought their insurance fraud fires would be attributed to accidental blazes rather than criminal conspiracy. Over the next 2 months, Bill coordinated with Investigator Santos's team to document comprehensive arson conspiracy involving insurance fraud, coordinated property destruction, and systematic fire setting that endangered firefighters while generating fraudulent insurance claims worth over $2 million. "We've arrested 7 suspects, including 2 property owners," Santos told him during a briefing at the fire station after the operation concluded. The arson conspiracy was targeting commercial properties for insurance fraud while coordinating fire timing to avoid detection and maximize claim payouts. "Firefighter safety impact?" Bill asked. "The deliberately set fires were designed to burn rapidly and unpredictably, creating extremely dangerous conditions for responding firefighters who thought they were battling accidental blazes rather than criminal arson designed to destroy evidence and generate insurance money." The investigation revealed that the arson conspiracy had been operating for over 2 years, systematically targeting properties for insurance fraud while coordinating fire timing and ignition methods to avoid detection by fire marshals who weren't looking for patterns that connected seemingly random blazes. Local news covered the story as a major arson conspiracy bust by state fire authorities, with no mention of the volunteer fire dispatcher who had recognized the arson patterns or the arson investigation veteran who had provided the expertise that protected both property owners and firefighters from criminals who used fire as a weapon for insurance fraud. A few weeks later, the state fire marshal's office approached Bill about developing enhanced arson detection protocols for volunteer fire departments. "Mr. Thompson," said State Fire Marshal Patricia Williams, "we understand you have extensive experience in emergency dispatch and fire pattern analysis." Bill looked around the Riverside Fire Department, where volunteer firefighters could respond to emergencies knowing they were saving lives and property, rather than risking their safety for criminals who set fires for profit, where communities could trust that blazes represented unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate arson. "Some," he said simply. "We'd like to implement enhanced reporting procedures for volunteer fire departments to recognize arson indicators. Would you be willing to help develop those protocols?" "Of course," Bill replied. "Protecting firefighters and communities from arson requires recognizing when fires are set deliberately for criminal purposes rather than accidentally, especially when insurance fraud is involved." What the fire marshal didn't know was that she'd just asked one of the state's most experienced arson investigators to design detection systems for protecting volunteer fire departments from exactly the kind of insurance fraud Arson Bill had spent his career fighting. Bill never told the volunteer firefighters about his arson investigation background or the insurance fraud conspiracies he'd dismantled. He never mentioned the arson networks he'd prosecuted or the criminals he'd helped convict for setting fires that killed innocent people and endangered emergency responders. He just worked the dispatch radio every evening, coordinated emergency responses that saved lives and property, and quietly watched for fire patterns that indicated arsonists were setting blazes for insurance fraud while endangering the firefighters who responded to save property that criminals had deliberately destroyed. But word spread through fire investigation circles that if anyone noticed unusual fire patterns or suspected arson coordination, they should probably consult with the dispatcher at Riverside Volunteer Fire Department, not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how arson conspiracies worked. Every evening from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., Bill continued his volunteer service. He coordinated emergency responses that protected lives and property, maintained communication with firefighters during dangerous operations, and monitored fire incidents with the kind of analytical observation that had kept him at the forefront of arson investigation for nearly 2 decades. Most evenings, the biggest challenge was managing routine emergency calls and ensuring that volunteer firefighters had the support they needed to serve their communities safely and effectively. But some evenings, when his trained instincts recognized patterns that indicated deliberate arson, Bill Thompson was exactly where he needed to be, between innocent communities and criminals who would set fires for insurance money while endangering the firefighters who risked their lives responding to blazes that criminals had set for profit. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career investigating arson crimes. You don't stop protecting communities and firefighters when you retire. You just find a new way to ensure that fires represent accidents rather than criminal acts. And sometimes the most important arson prevention in a region is provided by someone who looks like they're just coordinating emergency responses, but who knows exactly what deliberate fire setting looks like and refuses to let arsonists endanger firefighters or destroy property in any community he serves. Bill had spent 18 years investigating criminals who used fire as a weapon to commit insurance fraud while destroying businesses and homes. Now he spent his retirement ensuring that one fire department remained a place where firefighters responded to genuine emergencies rather than deliberately set fires designed to generate fraudulent insurance claims. The mission was the same, the fires were the same. The only difference was that now, instead of investigating arson crimes after property was destroyed and lives were endangered, he was preventing criminal fire setting by recognizing the patterns before arsonists could complete their insurance fraud conspiracies. And every evening, as volunteer firefighters protected lives and property through professional emergency response, Bill Thompson worked with the eyes and experience of someone who knew the difference between accidental fires and deliberate arson, ready to protect both the firefighters and the communities that depended on emergency services, remaining focused on saving lives rather than responding to crimes. So the next time you see volunteer firefighters responding to an emergency call, remember that the person coordinating their response might have expertise far beyond emergency dispatch. The dispatcher ensuring their safety might be the same person who spent their career investigating criminals who set fires to commit insurance fraud while endangering the lives of emergency responders. Have you ever met someone like Bill? Someone whose volunteer work perfectly positioned them to protect emergency responders using their professional expertise? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop ensuring that firefighters face genuine emergencies rather than criminal acts designed to profit from property destruction. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting firefighters from arson criminals. Because the world needs more people like Bill Thompson, professionals who understand that some protection is too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear investigator badges and prosecute arson crimes. Sometimes they work dispatch radios and coordinate emergency responses. But they're always protecting communities from fire setters, always ensuring that firefighters respond to genuine emergencies rather than criminal acts, always ready to recognize when fires are weapons used by criminals rather than accidents that require heroic response. And sometimes the most important fire protection in your community comes from someone who spent their career learning exactly how arson works and refuses to let criminals endanger firefighters or destroy property in any community he calls home.